we talk a lot about the First World War. We never mention the Spanish flu, but I think it killed many more people. And so I went off and did my first Google search and saw these just gigantic numbers that you can't even really get your head around. It was about how on earth can this catastrophe have happened and we're not taught it in school, we don't read about it, we don't learn about it. It overshadowed in terms of death the two wars. According to some estimates, both of them put together, and we never talk about it. It was just a staggering thought to me.
Welcome to the Shaping Science podcast, where we talk with experts from science, academia, industry, and beyond to explore the latest in research, education, and innovation for the public good. Laura Spinney is a science journalist and author whose work explores how science, society, and culture interact. She's best known for her international bestseller, Pale Rider, The Spanish Flu of 1918, and How It Changed the World. The book redefined how we understand pandemics and their social aftermath. She writes in both English and French and contributes as well to The Economist, The Guardian, Nature, and National Geographic. Her latest book, Proto, How One Ancient Language Went Global, traces how it came to be that one language left the steppes of Ukraine and became the Earth's dominant language family. Laura, thank you so much for joining us on Shaping Science today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So, you're a science journalist, but you have written novels. You've written a kind of novelistic account of Lausanne. You have written a book on the flu, and now you've written a masterpiece on the history of migration and people moving across and out of the steppes of Central Asia, and what that tells us about both ancient language and language families today. And you clearly write about a lot of other things as well. Tell us a little bit about your story. How did you come to be interested in this kind of relationship between science and society, and how have you seen the kind of trajectory of your writing career?
I wish I could say that there had been a strategy, but it has been truly organic. I suppose that originally I envisaged that I would write fiction. I'm not sure that I have the imagination to be a fiction writer, though I have written 2 novels of which I'm very proud. But I am drawn to the non-fiction. I did work in the early days of my journalistic career for British Vogue and also for a newspaper called The Catholic Herald. Not that I'm a Catholic, but it was an interesting learning experience as a journalist. So I really have explored, and I kind of homed in on science because I studied science at university, natural sciences, and it seemed to me that science was always going to present me with new and fascinating questions, whereas fashion might not. And so, yeah, I kind of put those pieces together and became a science journalist. But I have always continued to explore other avenues, and I think I always will. I may even go back to fiction. You never know.
Ah, okay. Well, we'll follow that with interest. But let's go to your 2017 book, Pale Rider, which of course is about the last big, major flu that overtook the world in 1918, 1919, almost 100 years just before the last COVID episode we all had. But you wrote this in 2017. It is true that people were talking about the fact that a pandemic might happen. But, I was one of the people who would say routinely that science was important because it would help, protect us against a potential global pandemic. But none of us really thought it was coming.
No.
And I'm curious if you had some premonition when you started doing that project that this would not just be a historical project, but possibly something that would come to, maybe not in 3 years or whatever, but come to pass again.
I did know that there would be future pandemics, but I absolutely can't claim to have had any prescience. No, my goal was absolutely to fill a hole in our collective memory. And I mean, the story is that about 2013-ish, around there, many of the sort of science editors who I work for and I were putting our heads together and thinking, how can we mark the centenary of the Great War, the First World War? We write about science, so what are the scientific aspects that we can consider? And I was drawn into that whole project, and I was sent off to do some fascinating things. I went into the glaciers of the Italian Alps, which are melting, and so the remains of the high altitude battlefields are melting out of the ice, along with all
Oh, I
the
see.
remains, including the remains of the soldiers who died there, in very good condition. So that there's a race against time amongst these archaeologists to preserve that material and reconstruct what happened up there. So I was writing all about that, and I remember coming back from that trip actually and saying to my husband, this is so moving, all that's, that they're discovering now up there in the ice. And he sort of thought about it for a moment, and he said, we talk a lot about the First World War. We never mention the Spanish flu, but I think it killed many more people. And so I went off and did my first Google search and saw these just gigantic numbers that you can't even really get your head around. And that was it. I was on the road to that book. So, it was about how on earth can this catastrophe have happened? And we're not taught it in school. We don't read about it. We don't learn about it. It overshadowed, in terms of death, the two wars. According to some estimates, both of them put together. We never talk about it. It was just a staggering thought to me. So that was my goal. I had no no notion of another one coming along as soon as it did.
So tell us a little bit about the argument of the book, because of course it was a major world event, and as you just said, depending on what and how you measure the direct impact of the pandemic, it killed many people, and possibly as many as were killed by both world wars. But it was a genuinely global pandemic, and it had major impact in different parts of the world. I know that it had a huge impact in India. I actually grew up knowing about it because my mother's brother got the flu as, I think, a 2-year-old in Chicago. And it almost killed him, and it actually affected his health for the rest of his life. But you're absolutely right. In reading histories and in thinking about the kind of major events of the 20th century, which was, of course, action-packed in all kinds of ways, the Spanish flu was almost a kind of footnote.
Yeah, totally. And you've put your finger on it in a way, is that if you raise it in conversation, maybe not most people, but many people have a story from their family of somebody who was affected, somebody who recovered, or somebody who died. And quite often that changed the course of the family. And yet we don't have that collective memory. We don't have a sense of it having happened to society. And I think that's really important in the sense of looking forward as well. If we don't remember the pandemics that devastated us in the past, we aren't going to be that bothered about preparing for the future ones. So, and I think, there had been books about that pandemic, quite a famous one by Alfred Crosby, the historian. But he was really writing about the pandemic in the States, and it was a brilliant book, but it didn't go much beyond that. It did go a bit beyond that, but not very much, and it couldn't have done because the data sources weren't really available at the time. So I suppose what I was trying to do was to bring us up to date in terms of the historical work that had been done, but also in terms of the scientific work that had been done in terms of understanding that virus and its devastation and its after effects as well. So in a way, the kind of whole shape of that disaster in our memory had been resculpted in the light of new knowledge, and I wanted to depict that new shape.
But in terms of its global impact, one begins with, of course, how it gets named the Spanish flu. We've had, of course, a lot of debate about, whether COVID is the Chinese flu, and it has been called that by some notable figures in American political life. But I have read in various accounts that the flu didn't come from Spain at all. I read one that suggested it came from Kansas, and I know there are other accounts and possibly still debate about the actual origins and so on of that pandemic. But how did it become named the Spanish flu, and how did it sort of take on that kind of identity, even though obviously it was a
misnomer? Yes, because we know it didn't start in Spain, although we don't know where it did start. There are three main theories today which place it in Kansas, as you say, or in China, or in a British military camp at Etaples on the Channel coast of northern France. And in fact, if I had Spanish flu in the subtitle of my book, Pale Rider, the Spanish Flu and How It Changed the World, but I wouldn't have put it there post-COVID, because at the time my thinking was that's the only way that people know of that disaster. And so if I want to hook them in to read the book, I need to give them the piece of information that they already have about it. I think I should have called it the 1918 flu, or rather, if I had been writing it post-COVID, I would have called it the 1918 flu. I would have avoided repeating that historical error in the subtitle, which I think is an interesting sort of way of thinking about the naming of diseases in itself. So the reason it became known as the Spanish flu is essentially because Spain was neutral in the war and did not censor its press. So whereas France, Germany, Britain, and the US were censoring their press, supposedly in an effort not to lower the morale of their populations, they all had cases before Spain, but they didn't report on them. And so when the first cases were reported in Spain in May of 1918, the newspapers reported on them, and everybody, including the Spanish, thought that it was pulsing out from Spain. And it suited the warring nations for everybody to think that, so they encouraged it. And names have a habit of sticking. And I think one of the interesting differences between then and now is that we are so connected, our information is so instant and global that we fairly quickly knew that we were in the midst of something international that was traveling across borders. Okay, our response did not necessarily take that into account initially, but we did know that. We knew pretty quickly that there was this trouble in China and that it was coming towards us in the West. I don't think people had grasped that so quickly in 1918 because communications were not what they are now, and many people were illiterate, simply. And so there was a much greater sense of lots of local epidemics and people having different concepts of disease and the disease manifesting differently in different populations. They didn't even necessarily connect the dots and think that this was the same disease. So you see this fascinating sort of flowering of different names all over the place, which reflect in many ways the state of scientific knowledge in that population, or the perception of disease, quite simply. And it took them a while, and eventually they realize they're dealing with a global disaster, and they take on the name which has been given to it by the most powerful nations on earth, which are the ones fighting the First World War. So it became the Spanish flu.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, of course, one doesn't like to say this today, but censorship then clearly works and shapes what gets and how news gets reported and how names develop and how names stick. And this, of course, is a frightening thought given the levels of censorship that exist in the world today. But you did say in your own sort of prologue to how you got interested in doing the book that you were following archaeological excavations that were being done where glaciers were melting and revealing certain kinds of information about the war, about the First World War. And of course, this must be an interest that stuck, since you spend a lot of your time and much of your narrative in Proto is based on work of archaeologists. But let me ask you to go back a little bit to that. This is a very different book than Pale Rider. In this book itself, you say that there was a summer seminar in Santa Fe at the Santa Fe Institute for Complexity Studies that was part of the origin story of Proto. But again, going from global pandemic taking place in the early 20th century to 12,000 years BCE, and following a story as complex but different than the one you tell in Pale Rider. It must have been an interesting decision on your part, let me say.
Well, maybe that's the journalist prerogative, is to leap about.
Yeah, as an academic, we typically are constrained from doing those kinds of things, but nevertheless.
And actually, I think in this story, there was a particular service that a journalist could offer, because as soon as I started getting interested in it, and it's a story, maybe we'll come back to this, but could only be told with the sort of cooperation of three scientific disciplines: linguistics, archaeology, and genetics, basically because we're talking about languages that were prehistoric, were never written down. And I heard more than once from people working in these three fields that they spoke different languages and they didn't necessarily understand each other. And that was only a problem because things were advancing so fast in at least one of the fields, well, archaeology and paleogenetics, the ancient DNA, which has so revolutionized this story. So I think that as a journalist, perhaps at least temporarily, I can offer a service which is like translating to each other and bringing those stories, bringing those language, bringing the stories that each field is telling in a way that is understandable to the others, as well as to the general public, who are the people I'm really talking to, people like me who were ignorant before I started this. And Santa Fe was just this amazing sort of melting pot of people from all disciplines who came together to understand how the new science of complexity might impact on their particular fields. So there was this amazing kind of, bubbling of ideas and interdisciplinarity, which was fantastic. And I was there. I was one of two journalism fellows in the summer of 22. And I suppose until then I'd been interested in language, what writer is not interested in language? But I, as a science journalist, had written about it a lot from a sort of psychological neuroscience point of view. And what came home to me then is that this whole field of where these languages came from, the most spoken languages on Earth, was just being completely transformed, sort of, as we spoke, before our eyes by the new tools.
Well, I was going to ask you if there was a, kind of a story that began in some sense by observing how Europe has been, part of its history has been obviously about creating nation states that are contiguous with certain kinds of, linguistic tendencies and proclivities, although we know that print journalism had a great deal to do with consolidating languages and producing uniform language competency within nation states, often well after the nation is more or less established and the boundaries at least have been set out, if they've been nevertheless contested in one war after the next. But the question of language and its relationship to people is one that, of course, is very current, not just in Europe, but around the world. It is often the case that major political disputes and sometimes wars are fought about territory, but about language as much as territory, and language as mapped onto territory. And I was wondering if, in addition to your just sort of interest in thinking about the translational work that you were doing between archaeologists and linguists and geneticists, and the new kind of information that genetics brings to this whole field in work that has really been much more recent than a lot of the scholarship that's been done on this.
Yeah.
If it was also driven by this interest in the relationship between language and politics, I guess.
Totally. So, as you say, it's a subject, the origins of the Indo-European languages, that has been discussed for 200 years or more. I mean, longer in the sense of the time it took to develop a consciousness that there was this family of languages, that there were other families of languages that were different, and then to start asking questions about where they came from. But yeah, I was painfully aware from the beginning of how political language is, and even if it's in its definition, the difference between a language and a dialect. Famously,
Yeah.
a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. I think it was Max Feinreich who said that, a linguist himself. But my strategy was to just confront that head on. And you can't take the politics out of language. It is an inextricable part of our identity along with culture and our genes. And the thing is that you need those three parts. And those three parts don't necessarily travel together, or they're not transmitted together. And that's the complication, and that's the complexity at the heart of this story, is that, for example, we now know, thanks to ancient DNA, that we have migrated as a species since the beginning over vast distances, and, we've always done it. And when people move, they tend to take their languages with them for a while, but those languages change through the process, through coming into contact with other languages and so on. And so there is a correlation between people moving, that is genes moving, and languages moving, but it doesn't hold forever.
Right.
And when you don't have history books, when you don't have writing to track the words, then you're immediately in a space of speculation to some extent. But educated speculation, let's say controlled speculation, as someone cleverer than me put it.
But I was going. I want to ask the second kind of political question, which of course is the correlation between the fact that you started this project, at least you talk about beginning it in 2022. It all starts in Ukraine, and there's a lot going on in Ukraine in 2022, and questions about language and territory and national sovereignty, of course, come to the fore in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. To what extent was that part of your own migration, as it were, to this subject?
Yeah, it's a good question. In fact, the reason I'm here in New York is that I'm talking about this to the Ukrainian Institute of America tomorrow. But look, the reason that I wrote the book was to do with the science changing and the story being written because of the science. To me, it's a tragedy and a historical irony that at the same time this story is coming together and the sort of origins of this family are being pinpointed more and more narrowly to I'm not going to say modern Ukraine because it's not true. We're not talking about any space that fits neatly into modern national boundaries, but let's say the steppes of Eastern Europe is just something that was beyond my control, and in fact made my life quite difficult, because at one point I had to deliberate over whether I was going to go to Russia to speak to one of the leading experts in the world, an archaeologist on the steppe nomads who we think spoke the original Indo-European language. I decided to go because, well, for one philosophical reason, I think that science should strive to rise above the politics, and because I didn't think I could write a book about those people without consulting one of the major experts in the world. It wasn't easy. It was fascinating. But yes, so, and many of the archaeological sites that have yielded the evidence that have helped us to put this story together are now either destroyed or off limits and will be for many years. The museums where the material from those sites was transferred are also, if not destroyed, in a perilous state in many cases. So yeah, it's an absolutely tragic concatenation of events. And of course, the war itself is in part a war over language. So I think it's a coincidence that the science has come together at this time, but it's a terrible one.
Yeah, no, indeed. And of course, as you say so evocatively in your book, some of the archaeological sites that were very active and all of a sudden now can be subjected to new analytic techniques to try to fill out this story more completely are now, off limits because they have landmines and are in areas that, are obviously not safe to go to. And of course, archaeologists in Ukraine are not able to do their work often because they've been drafted off to war, or at the very least, because the conditions of life have completely transformed. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think it, not in any way to belittle what's happening now. That's the last thing I'd want to do. But it does bring home that border, that border between the steppe and the forest there in the east of Europe has been, and I think the story that I tell in the book brings this home also, has always been an important barrier in shaping cultures either side of it. It's been this place of destructive creation because two very different cultures and states of mind have come together there, and that in itself is really fascinating. So much of the reason that we speak the languages we do in Europe and in much of the rest of the world is to do with events at that border.
So let's go to the story of the book. And again, it's a marvelous and intricate story, and I highly recommend the book to all of our listeners. But nevertheless, in this podcast, I'd like to ask you to kind of summarize what your basic discoveries are. And I'm going to put this in the context too, and I'm saying this as an academic. I'm not at all surprised that theories come and theories go, and sometimes theories come back, which you've shown, and they come back and they disappear because of different kinds of evidence and different moments of scholarly debate. I mean, one of the great things about science, and I think this is true of history as well, is that you're constantly testing any of the propositions, any of the assumptions that you have as your baseline, and you're testing them. And you're testing them not only against new evidence, but new ways of analyzing that evidence. So you have different scholarly theories and different people who become the kind of dominant, interpreters of some of these questions, and then it turns out, lo and behold, that evidence comes along and things change.
Yeah.
But you nevertheless can weave together a story that is both a historical argument overall, as well as an account of how scholarship has changed, and in particular, and this is where I'd like you to begin, in particular with the rise of genetic data and DNA in particular. Until the late 20th century, most of this work is being done by archaeologists and by linguists.
Absolutely.
And historical linguistics has a long and interesting history, but it has a long and interesting history that also goes back into a set of European beliefs about nations, about peoples, about the way in which language, in fact, did move with people. And now all of a sudden you have a way of testing whether people actually moved and which people moved and when did they get to a place and how much did they intermarry and mix and all the rest of it, even if, to the present day, we still don't have texts or recordings of what they spoke. So there's just incredible complexity in the way in which you weave this narrative. But I'd like you to give a kind of overall account, perhaps, of how you see the story you tell in Proto.
I mean, so the story has to start with the historical linguistics because it is a story about language. And I mean, I mentioned earlier that, it was a slow process. I started in my book with Dante in the 14th century, realizing that there was a relationship between these languages. So we're talking about languages, 400 living ones today, by far the largest language family on earth, includes, English, Hindi, Spanish, Russian, and hundreds of others. And the realization that they belonged to a family, that they descended from a common root, which itself is a slightly controversial idea, has been at times, is one that coalesced slowly. But eventually, the linguists came up with this concept of a family tree, single root. It's definitely a simplification, but it has some truth in it. And then, because humans are endlessly curious, even though they knew they were talking about the origins of a family being way back in prehistory, before historical records, with Proto-Indo-European, we're probably talking about a language that died out 4,000 years ago and was never written down. You'd think there was no hope, but we are curious. We do ask questions about things, even if they're difficult to answer. And so we bring everything we can to bear on trying to find the answers to those questions. And the original collaboration, as you say, was with archaeologists. If linguists can say, well, we roughly think that this original common ancestor was spoken 1,000 years, perhaps roughly, before the first written records we have of an Indo-European language, which was Hittite, an Anatolian language spoken in what is now Turkey. The oldest of those records date back to about 2000 BC. So they had a vague idea that the origins of the family had to be at least 1,000 years older than that. So we're talking about 5,000 years ago from present. And so then they can go to the archaeologists and they can say, well, who was living in this part of the world then? How, what did they know? How did they live? What technologies did they have? What materials were they familiar with? What were their burial rites? What did they believe? As we can extract that from their burial rites and so on. And then because the linguists are very clever, because it's not only that they can reconstruct the family tree, they can also to some extent reconstruct the dead languages themselves. And they do that by what's called the comparative method. So they compare the inherited words, sounds, grammatical structures across the related languages in order to work out what the ancestral form sounded like. And so they've reconstructed a skeleton lexicon for this long dead language. And since we humans talk about the things that matter to us, they can take that lexicon to the archaeologists and they can say, well, look, these people talked about these things. Do you have a bunch of people who lived in a world that looked a bit like that, and where they might have needed those words, and where the words match the knowledge they had and the beliefs they had? And through that sort of process, they came up, I'd say let's say by the turn of the 20th century, there were two main theories for who had spoken that original ancestral language, Proto-Indo-European. These nomadic people who inhabited the steppes of Eastern Europe about 5,000 years ago, and the farmers of Anatolia, modern Turkey, who moved out from Turkey several millennia before that, moving east and west and carrying farming and perhaps these languages with them. But at that point, say by by about 2000, it was not possible to choose between those theories on the grounds of archaeology and linguistics alone. And then came this new science. Now, it's sort of generally accepted that migration is a major, if not the main, motor of language change. We talked about that earlier. People move, they carry their languages with them, at least for a bit. And we already knew, we'd had hints from archaeology and from genetics that people moved enormously in the past on a large scale. For example, the genetics could look at the genetic mix of a modern population and find traces of ancient migrations through them, how those mixes of genes came together. But they didn't have much time depth, because basically the most recent contributions to your genome, your parents, will dilute everything that came before. So you could only see back about 10 generations or so. The real revolution in the last sort of 15, 20 years was the ability to take DNA out of ancient human remains, to distinguish it from contaminating modern DNA, and to analyze it. And this just threw open the doors, really.
And this began when?
About 20 years ago, and I suppose it became common and widespread 10 years ago. And widespread and usable, available as a tool.
And you could get DNA from ancient skeletons?
From those samples that were in museums and from obviously new archaeological digs. And, that's another side story, because there was a big fight over, big struggle to get hold of those samples now and to analyze them in this new way and extract more information from them. And suddenly you could tell, what sex those people were, what they looked like to some extent, whether people buried in two cemeteries very far apart were related to each other. And so you could start to map out mating networks. You could start to map out migrations, because this first cousin has a first cousin over there who died at about the same time. So there must have been a migration between them on a very large scale.
And you can do it at that level of, you can also date to that level of specificity.
Yes, you can, in the best conditions, date to within a couple of generations, human generations. So yes, not always. and sometimes it was a little difficult to get the relative chronology right. But you had a lot more information than you did have previously. And suddenly you could see that those nomads in the steppe radiated massively, basically starting about 5,000 years ago. And they moved east and west. They moved, basically, you can map the diaspora of the early Indo-European languages fairly neatly onto the diaspora of those nomads out of the steppe. And since the linguists were also fairly confident that the age of the Indo-European language family fitted better with the steppe hypothesis than with the older Anatolian hypothesis, this tipped the balance of the debate in favor of the steppe hypothesis. So now the consensus is that it was those nomads who carried the Indo-European languages out of the steppe about 5,000 years ago. And, you know, I mean, I call it in my book, you know, the most important thing to have happened in the old world in the last 5,000 years, because, you know, okay, discuss, but the languages that we speak, which replaced the languages that were there before, and the stories that travel with those languages, and the subtleties in the way you think because of the language you speak, all of that changed in one fell swoop at that point. And I think, you know, you'd be hard pushed to find another change over such an enormous geographical scale that had the same import.
Now, you tell in the book stories about, and you just mentioned this in terms of the difference between the kind of political economy of Anatolia and of the steppes, the encounters of nomads and farmers. And, you know, these days when people talk about the digital revolution, they frequently go back and say this is a revolution like the agricultural revolution, like the industrial revolution. Well, as you retell the story of the agricultural revolution here, well, it took place over thousands of years, and it didn't just take over the globe. There were nomads, there were hunters and gatherers who continued to be shepherds and extremely migratory and nomadic at the same time that there were areas of the ancient world that were settled and farmed. And of course, you also have stories of climate change. You have the Ice Age, and then what, of course, that does to agriculture and what it makes possible for agriculture as it recedes. In going back and doing this kind of work, did you develop a different kind of sense of how societies change over time? And you know, obviously, your story is about language, but you're showing that these correlations between movement of peoples, between the spread of languages, was also part of a world that was, you know, coming to grips with tools, which of course are some of the major things that archaeologists look for and can find because they're often made of metal. But also different ways in which the environment is increasingly brought under a certain level of control that allows a new kind of economic regime to get established. You also, you know, write about trade, and even the extent to which there are certain languages that are associated with, you know, with entrepôts of trade that are specific to
lingua francas.
Lingua francas, yeah. So give us a little sense of how you kind of developed this understanding of, you know, some of the major social and economic changes of the early ancient world.
Yeah, it's that we are so incredibly adaptable as a species. And I mean, I think the sort of overall impression that you must come away with from my book, sort of whether you like it or not, is of just the huge dynamism of all these things, you know, genes, culture, language, obviously, and how we're constantly shaping. The three are shaping each other. We are shaping other peoples. The climate is shaping us. You know, it's endless, and it hasn't stopped, and it didn't stop when we imposed national boundaries on ourselves. But that also shaped us in important ways. I think I think perhaps the key to unraveling it all is that language is a tool.
Mm-hmm.
It's sometimes said that it's our oldest tool, but there's a big debate over how long we've been speaking. And it is a tool that enables us to better adapt to our environment by communicating with each other. And because our environment is constantly changing, the language must change too. I mean, I think that, the way that the descendants of the speakers of a language change the language, meet other people, the language changes, the culture changes, the technology changes, all of it is this constant sort of flowing together and flowing apart. In fact, that's probably, what this book has in common with my last book, is that in both cases I'm talking about things that go viral.
Yeah.
Things that that you can't talk about in compartments. You kind of have to talk about the whole world. And I apologize to the readers that, they have to deal with this huge geographical spread and spread of time. But it's the only way, really, as long as you do it sort of with humility and allowing for all the large pockets of uncertainty that there are in the story.
Some of the popular histories that are written make very deterministic kinds of arguments about how one thing shaped the world or whatever. And one of the things I admire about this book is that you're using a kind of global tableau and a very, long temporal backdrop to that, to boot, to tell about how complex, issues of identity really are. And to that extent, I think the book reminds us that many of the kinds of assumptions that we have as, members of a particular nation that have our own mythologies and national histories, as speakers, as both of us are, at least by birth, of English, how we have certain assumptions about language, and my accent is a little bit different than yours, and we could attribute that perhaps to where we were born and who our parents were and so on. But we make certain kinds of distinctions that we consider often to be fixed in time.
Yeah.
And your story is about how unfixed everybody and everything really is.
Yeah. I mean, even, the word indigenous, what do we mean? Depends at which point of time you look at.
Right. So
everybody has replaced somebody else. And this story just gets more and more complex and more dynamic. I've just been writing about, since the book came out, been writing about, there's a big debate now over infectious diseases. So back to my first subject, and what, the role that they played in this story, because as well as being able to extract the human DNA from ancient remains, the scientists can also extract the microbial DNA that those people were infected with and try to reconstruct the sort of waves of disease that shaped human movements over time. And so now, just to give you an example, there's a big question: what caused those nomads to move out of the steppe? It could have been simply population growth. They came up with this way of life that was so well adapted to that niche, to that environment, that they multiplied in numbers, and then there were too many of them for the grasslands to support, and so they moved in search of new land. But there's another theory that it may have been an epidemic that pushed them out of those heartlands, and that it could have been plague. In other words, the same disease that caused the Black Death of the Middle Ages, although not necessarily in the same form at that time.
I see.
We haven't nailed the chronology yet, but that's a big debate. So just to show you how the story continues to evolve.
Well, climate, disease, particularly global disease, and climate, of course, is global, seem to be the two things that in this current moment in our global history we think about a lot, and we think about how cataclysmic its effects are. History reminds one, on the one hand, that 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 peoples adjust and their histories are shaped and changed, but nevertheless, they persist. And yet that major things do change over time. I wondered if you had any kinds of thoughts about, how you take this historical story and tell it perhaps to young people today who are, were obviously grievously affected by the pandemic, but are also very, very concerned about the future of the planet in relation to climate change.
So, migration continues to be a big motor of language change, but we do live in a very different world from those steppe nomads that we've been discussing. We have writing, we have the internet, we have lots of things that slow down the evolution of language because they standardize it. But we also have other forces that accelerate it. So I think, and then there's climate change, which is going to accelerate. We're already in the crisis and it's going to get worse. But there is a debate over what will be the impact of that in terms of immigration. Will there be huge waves of immigration, or will the most vulnerable be trapped where they are? I don't think it's a closed story, that. And of course, the two different scenarios will have different linguistic consequences. But I think the main thing to say is, okay, it's very difficult to predict future language change. Perhaps AI will help us do that, but for the moment, no sensible linguist will put their head on the line and tell you how language is going to change in future. But it will change for sure. And I think already that's quite a disturbing thought for most people. People have an idea, sort of, default assumption that their languages don't change, that they, that there is that there's an inertia there, and that's because it's part of their identity. But the fact is that, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren will not be speaking exactly the same as we are. And that depends partly on gradual accumulative drift and on major geopolitical events. So, it's interesting to think about coming back and listening to, how your great-grandchildren speak. Right. And it won't be the same.
Yeah. One last thought, and our time is coming to a close, but one last thought is that one of the things you mention in the book is how oftentimes the assumption that, there's only a single language is what gets imposed on at least popular notions of historical linguistics. But in fact, in most parts of the world, many languages are spoken. That's certainly true in South Asia, where I've spent a great deal of time.
Yeah.
And where there are languages, of course, that are Indo-European, but also languages that are called dialects, even though they're spoken by many, many people, and other languages from other language families that have coexisted and continue to coexist, not always peaceably. There are language disputes that take place and politics around those disputes. But language is still not only changing all the time, but multiple in terms of how most people actually relate to speech and writing, for that matter.
So for most of humanity's existence, most languages had 1,000 to 2,000 speakers, and everybody was multilingual. And the idea of a national language is only a couple of centuries old. Before that, if you looked at a map of Europe, for example, or North America, it would have been dialect chains.
Right.
Those still exist, but now we have the national languages imposed on top of them. So yeah, I think, we do live in a slightly odd world linguistically, and if we went just 200 years back, it would have looked completely different.
Well, our time now has come to a close. Thank you, Laura, so much for joining us, and thank you all for joining us for another episode of Shaping Science. To learn more about the New York Academy of Sciences, including information on upcoming events, visit us online at nyas.org and follow us at NIAS Sciences. Shaping Science is made possible with the generous support of Tata Sons.